Monday mornings in our office usually sounded the same. The quiet hum of computers waking up, the slow drip of coffee machines in the break room, the occasional sigh of someone realizing it was. In fact, Monday, again, nothing dramatic ever happened there. No shouting, no scandals, no heroic speeches, just spreadsheets. And yet, one Monday morning, everything felt slightly different. Not loud, different, just strange. I remember pushing open the glass door of the office at 8:47 a.m., holding a cup of coffee that was probably too strong and definitely too hot. The room smelled like burnt toast and printer ink. Normal things, comforting things. I walked to my desk, set my bag down, and turned on my computer. The screen flickered to life, and there it was. A new email. The subject line was written in capital letters. Urgent. Mandatory leadership meeting. I blinked. That was unusual. Leadership meetings weren't rare in our company, but they usually involved, well, actual leadership. Curious. I clicked the email, and that's when I noticed the sender, Brandon Cole. Not the CEO, not a manager, not even a team lead. Brandon worked in sales. Nice enough guy. Talked a lot in meetings. Liked to use words like vision and strategy. But leadership, that was new. I scrolled through the email. It looked official. Bullet points, agenda items, a meeting room reservation, even a line that read, "Attendance is expected from all departments." I leaned back in my chair. Across the room, people were slowly arriving. Someone laughed near the coffee machine. A keyboard clacked somewhere behind me. Everything looked normal, but something felt off, because, according to Brandon's email, there was now a mandatory leadership meeting at 9:00 a.m. for everyone, and somehow, nobody seemed to question it. At Optchinzech Shinoa M. People started walking toward the conference room. Marketing, engineering, support, even the interns. I followed them, partly curious, partly confused. The conference room door was already open. Inside, the large whiteboard on the wall had writing on it, big letters, black marker, company strategy. And standing in front of it was Brandon. He held a marker in one hand like it was a microphone. His sleeves were rolled up, his posture confident, like someone who had done this many times before. He glanced at the room as people took their seats. Then he smiled. The kind of smile people use when they believe they're about to say something important. He tapped the marker gently against the whiteboard. Twice. The room grew quiet. Then Brandon said, calmly, "All right, team. Let's talk about our company strategy." No one laughed. No one interrupted. No one asked the obvious question, which was strange, because as far as anyone knew, Brandon Cole was still just a regular employee. Yet here he was, running a meeting, standing under the words "company strategy" written across the whiteboard like a headline. And the strangest part, everyone stayed. Everyone listened. For the next 30 minutes, Brandon spoke about goals, metrics, growth opportunities. He drew arrows and boxes across the whiteboard. He asked questions. People answered. A few even took notes. It was surreal, like watching someone quietly step into a role that no one had officially given them. And somehow, no one stopped him. Not that day. Not the next week. Not even the week after that. Because Brandon didn't stop at meetings. Slowly, subtly, he began doing something else. At first it was small, almost harmless. But over time, it started to feel like something much bigger. Something nobody had planned. Something nobody had approved. Something nobody seemed willing to question. Brandon Cole, a sales employee with no official authority, had started acting like the CEO of the company. And the strange thing was, the real CEO, Mr. Harrison Blake, didn't seem to know, or maybe didn't understand what was actually happening. But the moment everything truly changed was the day Brandon did something no one expected. Not a speech, not another meeting. Something much simpler, much stranger. One morning, Brandon Cole started assigning work, not suggesting, not recommending, assigning. And that's when people in the office slowly began to realize this might not be a joke anymore. Most people imagine workplace drama as something loud, arguments, slamming doors, emails written in all caps. But in reality, the strangest office stories often begin quietly. Ours certainly did. Because if you had walked into our office 3 months before Brandon's leadership meeting, you would have noticed something almost peaceful about the place. It wasn't chaotic. It wasn't tense. It was simply loose, like a ship sailing without a very strict captain. Our company was a mid-sized startup called Northbridge Analytics, about 60 employees, open office layout, a few glass conference rooms, and a CEO who, according to rumor, existed mostly in airports and investor meetings. His name was Harrison Blake. Most of us had only seen him during company-wide video calls, in person, maybe twice a year. Our direct managers worked remotely from different cities, which meant the office itself ran on a very simple system. People showed up, people did their jobs, and nobody asked too many questions. For some employees, that was stressful. For others, it was perfect. I belonged firmly in the second group. My name is Daniel Park. I worked in marketing, nothing glamorous, mostly campaign reports, content schedules, and analytics dashboards. I had been at Northbridge for 3 years, long enough to know everyone's coffee order, long enough to understand the unofficial rules of the office. Rule number 1, don't create unnecessary drama. Rule number 2, if things are working, don't try to fix them. My daily routine was simple. Arrive around 8:45, coffee first, headphones on, work quietly, leave around 5:30. Some people loved big ideas, big strategies, big speeches about innovation. Personally, I preferred things that worked quietly in the background. Predictable tasks, manageable deadlines, no surprises, which is exactly why Brandon Cole fascinated me. Because Brandon was the opposite of predictable. He had joined the company about 8 months earlier. Sales department, tall, confident, always dressed slightly more formal than everyone else, even on casual Fridays. While most of us wore sneakers and hoodies, Brandon wore button-down shirts, sometimes even a blazer. But it wasn't his clothes people noticed. It was the way he spoke. Brandon talked like he was always halfway through a motivational conference. You could be standing near the printer and hear him say things like, "We need to think bigger about our market positioning." Alignment across departments is the real key to scaling. Nobody in the office used the word alignment that often, except Brandon. At first, his behavior seemed harmless, almost entertaining. During meetings, he would raise his hand and say, "I have a quick thought about strategy." Sometimes his ideas were actually useful. Sometimes they were ambitious, but nothing unusual. Lots of people in startups like talking about strategy. The difference was that most people stopped there. Brandon didn't. At some point, something subtle began to change. It started with suggestions, small ones. He would walk past someone's desk and say, "Hey, have you considered organizing that dashboard by weekly targets? I think the marketing team could benefit from clearer metrics." People would nod politely. Sometimes they even tried his suggestions. No big deal. Then the suggestions became emails, friendly at first. Things like, "Hey team, just sharing an idea for improving cross-department communication." Still harmless. But then came the spreadsheets. Brandon created a shared document titled Operational Alignment Tracker. No one remembered asking for it. Yet somehow, people began filling it out. At first, maybe 3 people used it, then 5, then 10. Not because anyone required it, but because Brandon kept mentioning it, casually, persistently. "Did you see the tracker? Let's update the tracker. The tracker will help us stay aligned." Soon the document became normal, and that's when something interesting happened. People began coming to Brandon with questions, not about sales, about workflow, about priorities, about who should be doing what. It was subtle, almost invisible, but slowly, Brandon was positioning himself in the center of things, like a quiet gravitational pull inside the office. And the strangest part, no one officially gave him that position. He simply stepped into it. The first time I realized something unusual was happening was during a Tuesday afternoon meeting. Marketing, product, and sales were discussing a new campaign launch. The discussion was going nowhere. People talking in circles, different opinions, no decisions. Finally, Brandon leaned forward in his chair. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't interrupt. He simply said, "Okay, let's simplify this." The room went quiet. He stood up, walked to the whiteboard, and started drawing boxes, arrows, timelines. Within 5 minutes, the messy conversation suddenly looked organized, clear, structured. Everyone stared at the board. Brandon capped the marker and said calmly, "Let's try this approach for 2 weeks." No vote, no manager approval. Yet, strangely, everyone agreed. The campaign followed Brandon's plan. And to be fair, it worked. The numbers improved. The project moved faster. People started joking about it later. Someone in engineering said Brandon should just run the whole office. Everyone laughed, including Brandon. But looking back now, that might have been the moment everything began. Because once people see someone solving problems, they start expecting it. And Brandon liked solving problems, especially big ones, especially ones that sounded important. A few weeks later, something new appeared in our shared company chat. A short message from Brandon. "Hey everyone, thinking of organizing a weekly leadership lunch for anyone interested in improving team coordination." Leadership lunch. The phrase sounded ambitious, but free food has a powerful influence in offices. 12 people showed up the first week. They sat around the break room table eating sandwiches while Brandon talked about productivity. He used phrases like strategic direction, long-term growth, cross-team synergy. Some people rolled their eyes. Others seemed genuinely interested. But week by week, more people attended. Soon there were 15, then 20. Eventually, the small break room table wasn't big enough. They moved the meetings to the conference room. And that's when the whiteboard started appearing again. The same one from that Monday meeting. The whiteboard with thick black marker lines. At first, it held simple notes. Project goals, sales targets, campaign ideas. But slowly, the writing became bigger, bolder, more official. One afternoon, I walked past the conference room and glanced inside. The whiteboard had 3 words written across the top. Large, confident, company strategy. It looked almost like a headline, like something that belonged in an executive meeting. Except there were no executives in the room, just Brandon, standing there, explaining something to a group of employees who were listening carefully. I paused outside the glass wall for a moment, watching, and I remember thinking something strange. Not that Brandon was pretending to be the boss. Not exactly. It was something more subtle than that. It felt like the office had quietly decided that someone needed to be in charge, and Brandon had simply volunteered. But the thing about quiet changes is that people often ignore them, until one day, they suddenly become impossible to ignore. That day arrived when Brandon sent the email, the one with the subject line, "Urgent, mandatory leadership meeting." And when he stood in front of the whiteboard that morning, marker in hand, talking about company strategy like it was his responsibility, something shifted inside the room. Because that whiteboard, the one we had seen for weeks, the one Brandon kept writing on, was no longer just a place for ideas. It had become something else. A symbol, a stage, and Brandon was standing right in the center of it, which might have been harmless if he had stopped there, but Brandon didn't stop. Because a few days later, he started introducing a new phrase, a phrase none of us had heard before, a phrase that sounded strangely official. Brandon Cole began referring to himself as acting leadership. If you had asked anyone in our office what they thought about Brandon Cole during those first few weeks of his leadership era, you would have received very different answers. Some people admired him. They said things like, "Finally, someone is organizing things. At least he's trying to improve the workflow." Others were less impressed. Engineering mostly ignored him. Customer support treated his emails like optional reading, and marketing, my department, fell somewhere in the middle. We watched, we observed, but we didn't interfere, because the truth was, Brandon hadn't actually done anything wrong. Not technically. He hadn't broken any rules. He hadn't shouted at anyone. He hadn't demanded authority. He simply behaved as if authority had always belonged to him, and somehow that made it harder to challenge. Still, the question lingered quietly in the back of my mind. Why was he doing this? Because people don't suddenly wake up one morning and decide to run an office they don't manage. There's usually a story behind that kind of confidence, or behind that kind of obsession. I found out the story by accident. It happened late one evening. Most people had already gone home. The office lights were dimmed to the soft yellow glow used during overtime hours. Cleaning staff moved quietly through the hallways, and the usual office noise had disappeared. No conversations, no phones ringing, just the soft tapping of keyboards. I was finishing a marketing report that had taken longer than expected when I noticed the conference room light was still on. The glass door was slightly open. Inside, Brandon stood alone, facing the whiteboard again. The same whiteboard, only this time it wasn't covered in arrows and strategy diagrams. It was mostly empty. Just a few words written near the top. Growth, ownership, leadership. Brandon stood there, with the marker in his hand, staring at those words like they meant something personal. I wasn't planning to interrupt, but he noticed me walking past. "Working late too?" he asked. His voice sounded normal, not like the confident meeting voice, just tired. "Yeah," I said. "Campaign report." He nodded. For a moment, neither of us said anything. Then he gestured toward the empty chairs. "Sit for a minute." I hesitated, but curiosity is a powerful thing. So I stepped inside the conference room and took a seat. Brandon leaned against the table, spinning the marker slowly between his fingers. "You ever worked somewhere that ignored a good idea?" he asked. It was such a specific question that I laughed quietly. "Probably," I said. "Most companies do." Brandon didn't laugh. He looked at the whiteboard again. "I used to work at a much bigger company before this," he said. The tone of his voice had changed. Not dramatic, just more serious. Corporate consulting firm. Thousands of employees. He paused, then continued. "I was only there 2 years, but I had this project idea." I didn't interrupt. Sometimes when people start telling a story like that, they're not really looking for answers. They're just finally ready to say it out loud. It was a system for predicting client demand using behavioral data. Brandon said, "A lot of modeling, forecast patterns." He shrugged slightly. "I spent months working on it." I could picture it. Late nights, slides, spreadsheets, Brandon staring at a screen full of numbers while the rest of the office slowly went dark. Eventually, I presented it to my manager. He continued, and then to a director. He tapped the marker softly against the table. They listened. He smiled faintly. "But you know the smile people give when they're already planning to say no?" I nodded. Everyone in corporate environments knows that smile. The polite one. The "thank you for your enthusiasm" smile. The director told me something I'll probably never forget. Brandon said, his voice had gone quieter. He said, "That's a creative idea." Brandon. "But it's too early for something like that here." Brandon looked at the whiteboard again. Then, he finished the story. They shut the project down. Just like that. Months of work. Gone in a 10-minute meeting. What happened after I asked? Brandon gave a small, humorless laugh. For a while, nothing. He uncapped the marker and drew a short line across the whiteboard. Then about 6 months later, he wrote a company name next to the line. A competitor, a consulting firm in Chicago, launched a new analytics platform. Another line. Predicting client demand using behavioral modeling. He stepped back. The two lines on the board looked identical. The same idea, the same concept. Only one had been rejected, and their system exploded. Brandon said, "Industry awards. Media coverage." He turned toward me. "You ever have that feeling where you watch something succeed, and you realize you saw it first?" I nodded slowly. "Yeah." I said. Brandon capped the marker. That was the moment I understood something. He said it carefully, almost like a conclusion he had been rehearsing for a long time. The problem wasn't the idea. He tapped the board once. The problem was leadership. The room felt very quiet suddenly, not uncomfortable, just serious. Brandon continued, "Companies don't fail because people lack ideas." He said, "They fail because the people in charge don't recognize them." He paused, then added, "Or they're too afraid to try." He walked back toward the table and sat down across from me, and for the first time since I had known him, Brandon didn't look confident. He looked determined, like someone who had spent months replaying a single moment in their head, over and over. I promised myself something after that. He said, "What?" Brandon looked directly at me. His eyes were calm, but there was intensity behind them. I promised myself I would never sit quietly again while bad leadership wasted good ideas. That sentence hung in the air between us for a few seconds. The office felt even quieter than before. Then Brandon stood up. He walked back to the whiteboard, and under the words already written there, he added one more sentence. Slowly, carefully. Sometimes someone has to step up. He paused, then finished the thought, even if nobody asked them to. That was the moment I realized something important about Brandon. He wasn't playing a game. He wasn't joking about leadership. He believed in it, completely, in his mind. He wasn't pretending to run the office. He was fixing something broken, and once a person starts believing that, it becomes very hard to convince them they're wrong. The next morning, Brandon was back in the conference room, marker in hand, whiteboard covered in diagrams again. And this time, he wasn't just sharing ideas anymore. He was making decisions. But the real turning point, the moment when things shifted from strange to potentially dangerous for the entire office dynamic, happened a few days later, because one morning, an email arrived, another email from Brandon Cole. But this one looked different, more official, more structured. The subject line read, "New weekly reporting structure." And for the first time, Brandon wasn't suggesting something. He was telling everyone what to do. The email arrived on a Thursday morning. Not early, not late, just after 9:00 a.m. when most people had already opened their inbox and settled into the rhythm of the day. Subject line, "New weekly reporting structure." Sender, Brandon Cole. I stared at it for a moment before opening it, partly because I was curious, partly because something about the wording felt different. Inside the email was a neatly formatted document, clear headings, bullet points, deadlines. It began with a line that sounded surprisingly formal. To improve cross-department transparency and operational efficiency, the following reporting structure will be implemented starting this week. I scrolled down. Every team was listed. Marketing, engineering, sales, customer support. Each department had instructions. Each department had a reporting format. Each department had a deadline, Friday 3:00 p.m. There was even a template attached, a spreadsheet titled Weekly Operational Summary. I blinked slowly. This wasn't a suggestion. This wasn't a casual idea. This was a system, and it was written exactly the way official company policies usually looked, except for one detail. No one in the email thread was a manager. No department head. No executive approval. Just Brandon. Across the office, I noticed people reacting in almost identical ways. Someone in engineering leaned back in his chair. A customer support agent whispered to the person beside her, near the window, Two interns stared at their screens like they had just received homework from a substitute teacher who wasn't actually their teacher. Finally, someone said the question everyone was thinking. It came from the product team. Quiet. Confused. Wait. A pause. Does Brandon have authority for this? No one answered. Because technically, he didn't. But something strange had already begun happening in the office over the past few weeks. Brandon had created momentum. The leadership lunches, the whiteboard sessions, the strategy meetings, the operational tracker, one small action at a time. He had built something that looked almost official. So when the email arrived, people didn't react with outrage. They reacted with uncertainty. And uncertainty, in an office environment, often turns into compliance. At Noa Patruzec Shichincha. Another message appeared in the company chat from Brandon. Quick sync meeting in conference room B at 1030 to walk through the reporting structure. The words quick sync meeting sounded harmless, but by now, most of us had learned what that phrase really meant. Another presentation, another whiteboard session, another moment where Brandon would explain how the company should work. Still, curiosity won again. At Zech Doazech. Shiopta. People slowly gathered in the conference room. I took a seat near the back, not too close, not too far. The whiteboard was already filled with diagrams, boxes connected by arrows, department names, deadlines, and right at the top of the board, written in thick black marker, operational reporting flow. Brandon stood beside the board, with a laptop open on the table. He looked calm, focused, like someone about to deliver an important briefing. Thanks for coming, everyone, he said, as people settled into their chairs. No introduction, no hesitation, just straight into the meeting. Brandon clicked to the first slide. A chart appeared on the screen. Our teams are doing great work, he began, but we're missing something important. He paused for emphasis. Visibility. The word hung in the air. Brandon walked toward the whiteboard and pointed to the diagram. Right now, each department operates independently, he said. That creates gaps. He drew a line between two boxes. What we need is a simple structure that keeps everyone aligned. Aligned. There was that word again. Brandon continued speaking, confident, measured, like someone who had practiced this explanation several times already. He explained the reporting template, the Friday deadline, how the information would help optimize decision-making. And to be fair, none of it sounded unreasonable. In fact, several people in the room nodded quietly, because the system Brandon described actually made sense. That was the tricky part. The idea itself wasn't bad. What made it strange was the person delivering it. Halfway through the meeting, Brandon looked around the room. Any questions? For a moment, nobody spoke. Then I heard my own voice. Not loud, just clear enough to break the silence. Did the CEO approve this? The question landed like a small stone dropped into still water. Ripples, people shifting in their chairs. A few eyes turned toward Brandon. He didn't look surprised. He didn't look offended either. Instead, he paused, just long enough to make the room slightly uncomfortable. Then he smiled. Not a defensive smile, more like the calm expression of someone who had expected the question all along. Leadership sometimes requires initiative. Brandon said. The answer wasn't exactly a yes, but it wasn't a no either. And strangely, that seemed to satisfy the room. No one challenged him. No one followed up. The meeting continued. Brandon finished the presentation, explained the template again, asked everyone to submit their first reports by Friday afternoon. When the meeting ended, people stood up slowly. Some chatted quietly. Others walked back to their desks without saying anything. As I stepped out into the hallway, I heard two engineers talking behind me. Are we actually doing this? I guess so. Another voice from marketing joined the conversation. It's not a bad idea. And that was the moment I realized something surprising. The office wasn't resisting Brandon. Not really. They were adapting. Because in the absence of clear leadership, people often accept the first person willing to step forward, even if that person isn't supposed to be in charge. By Friday afternoon, the first reports started appearing in the shared folder. Marketing submitted theirs. Sales followed. Customer support uploaded a summary of weekly tickets. Even engineering, who had been skeptical, eventually added a short update. The system Brandon created was now real, operational, active, and Brandon watched it unfold with quiet satisfaction. But something about the situation continued bothering me. Not because Brandon's system was wrong, but because of what might happen if the real leadership noticed. If Harrison Blake, the CEO of Northbridge Analytics, suddenly walked into the office and saw what was happening, how would he react? Would he laugh? Would he shut it down immediately? Or would something much stranger happen? At the time, none of us knew the answer, because Harrison Blake rarely visited the office. Most employees had never spoken to him directly. For many people, the CEO was more of an abstract idea than a real presence, which meant Brandon's little leadership experiment continued without interruption. Week after week, the reports arrived, the templates improved, the meetings continued, and Brandon's confidence grew. But the moment that changed everything, the moment that pushed Brandon's role from unusual to undeniable, arrived on an ordinary Tuesday morning. No announcement, no warning, just a quiet message from reception. 3 simple words: the CEO is here. And suddenly, every person in the office realized something at the exact same time. Harrison Blake was about to see what Brandon had been doing. For weeks, the message from reception spread through the office the way weather warnings spread through small towns. Quietly, but quickly, the CEO is here. 3 simple words. Yet within seconds, the energy in the entire office changed. People sat up straighter. A few quickly closed unrelated browser tabs. Someone near the break room whispered, "Is this a scheduled visit?" No one seemed to know, because Harrison Blake almost never appeared without notice. Most of the time, we only saw him during quarterly video calls, a calm face on a screen, a voice discussing growth projections, and then the meeting would end. But now the CEO was physically inside the building, walking through the same hallways we used every day, which raised a quiet, uncomfortable question. What would happen when he saw the system Brandon had built? Because by now, the system was impossible to miss. Every department used the reporting template. Every Friday, the shared dashboard updated automatically. Weekly coordination meetings had become normal, and at the center of it all was Brandon, standing in front of the whiteboard, talking about company direction. 10 minutes after the message from reception appeared, the office door opened, and Harrison Blake walked in. He looked exactly like he did in the company videos. Mid-40s, calm expression, dark jacket, someone who carried the kind of quiet confidence people associate with executives. But he didn't enter like a storm. There was no dramatic announcement, no big speech. He simply walked through the office, nodding politely to people at their desks. "Morning. Good to see you. Hope things are going well." Employees greeted him carefully, respectfully, but the mood in the room felt slightly tense, like everyone was waiting for something to happen. Harrison stopped near the engineering desks first, asked a few questions, looked at someone's screen, then continued walking. When he reached the conference room, he paused. The door was open. Inside, the whiteboard was still covered with Brandon's diagrams from that morning's planning session. Large arrows, department names, metrics, and right at the top, written in thick marker, company strategy. Harrison stepped inside. He studied the board for a few seconds. Then he asked the most natural question in the world. Who organized all this? The office grew very quiet, because at that moment, every single person in the room knew the answer. People slowly turned their heads and looked at Brandon. Brandon was standing near the table, reviewing something on his laptop. He looked up when he noticed everyone staring. Then he noticed Harrison, for the first time since I had known him. Brandon hesitated, just slightly, but only for a second. Then he stood up straight, "I did," he said. Harrison studied him, not suspiciously, not angrily, just thoughtfully. "You work in sales." "Right," the CEO asked. "Yes," Brandon replied. "But I've been helping coordinate some cross-team operations." The explanation was careful, not dishonest, but not entirely complete either. Harrison looked back at the whiteboard, then at the dashboard on the conference room screen. Data from multiple departments, weekly summaries, performance charts. He nodded slowly. "Interesting." The word echoed through the room. No one moved. No one spoke. Harrison walked closer to the whiteboard. He traced one of the arrows with his finger. "Who built this reporting structure?" Again. Everyone looked at Brandon. Brandon cleared his throat. "I put the template together." Another quiet moment passed. Then Harrison said something none of us expected. "Carry on." That was it. No criticism, no correction, just 2 words. And with that, Harrison Blake left the conference room and continued walking through the office, talking to employees, checking on projects, like nothing unusual had happened at all. When he finally exited the building 20 minutes later, the office remained completely silent for almost a full minute. Then someone whispered from the back of the room, "Did that just work?" Another voice replied, "I think the CEO just approved Brandon." Someone else added quietly, "Well, that's new." But the person who changed the most in that moment was Brandon. You could see it immediately. His shoulders relaxed. His posture straightened. The hesitation from earlier disappeared, because in Brandon's mind, something very important had just happened. The CEO had seen everything, the meetings, the whiteboard, the reporting system, and instead of shutting it down, he had said, "Carry on," to Brandon. That meant validation, recognition, maybe even promotion. And from that day forward, his confidence doubled. The weekly meetings became more structured. The reporting system expanded. Brandon began reviewing departmental progress during Monday briefings. Not aggressively, not arrogantly, but with the calm authority of someone who believed he had received executive approval. And strangely enough, many employees accepted it. Some even liked it, because Brandon solved problems quickly. He made decisions. He kept projects moving. Things that had once taken weeks of discussion now took hours. But not everyone felt comfortable with the situation. A quiet divide began forming inside the office. One group started calling themselves half-jokingly Team Brandon. They liked the organization, the direction, the energy. Another group had a different nickname for the situation. They called it "What is Happening?" Because from their perspective, something very strange was unfolding. A sales employee had quietly become the most influential person in the office, without a promotion, without a title, without official authority. And yet, no one had stopped him. At first, I stayed neutral, just watching. But a few days after the CEO's visit, something happened that made me look at the situation differently. I was reviewing the weekly report dashboard when I noticed something odd. The CEO had commented on one of the reports, not directly, just a short note attached to a summary file. It read, "Thanks to whoever is coordinating these updates. Helpful overview." That seemed harmless, but the more I read the comment, the more something didn't feel right, because Harrison hadn't mentioned Brandon by name. In fact, the wording suggested something else entirely. Something subtle, something important. It sounded like the CEO believed the reporting system was part of a small internal coordination effort, not a leadership structure, not a company-wide directive, just someone helping organize information, which meant the CEO might not understand what Brandon was actually doing. He might believe Brandon was simply helping gather reports, not assigning work, not running meetings, not guiding company strategy from a whiteboard in the conference room. And if that misunderstanding ever became clear, the consequences could be awkward. For Brandon, for the office, for everyone involved, because Brandon believed the CEO had approved his leadership. But what if the CEO had simply misunderstood the situation? And if that was true, then sooner or later, someone would have to explain it. The question was only this, and more importantly, When, for the next 2 weeks, the office moved forward as if Brandon's leadership had always existed. Monday meetings, Friday reports, whiteboard sessions. The system had rhythm now, predictable, structured, in some ways, even efficient. Projects moved faster, teams communicated more, deadlines became clearer, which made the situation more complicated, because when something works, people hesitate to question it, even if they're not sure it should exist. Brandon seemed more confident than ever. He walked through the office like someone who had quietly been promoted, not loudly, not arrogantly, but with the calm certainty of someone who believed the system, now recognized his role. And every Monday morning, the whiteboard appeared again. Different diagrams, different arrows, different strategy notes, but always the same place, front and center in the conference room. The board had become a kind of stage, and Brandon stood on it every week. One afternoon, I noticed something else. Brandon had started using a new phrase, not often, but just enough to stand out. He would say things like, "As leadership, we need to consider the long-term picture. Our leadership direction this quarter should focus on leadership." The word appeared again and again, like a title, slowly forming out of thin air. Most people accepted it, some even repeated it, but every time I heard it, I remembered the comment from the CEO's dashboard note, the line that kept echoing in my mind, "Thanks to whoever is coordinating these updates." Not leading, coordinating. The difference between those two words was small, but important, because if Harrison Blake believed Brandon was just organizing reports, then he had no idea what the office looked like every Monday morning. No idea that Brandon was assigning priorities, guiding discussions, directing workflow. No idea that half the office had started treating him like a department head. And the longer that misunderstanding continued, the bigger the moment of discovery would become. The realization hit me one Wednesday afternoon. I was reviewing marketing data when a new meeting invitation appeared in my calendar. Subject line: Quarter Strategy, Alignment, Organizer, Brandon Cole. Attendees: almost the entire office, but one name on the list stood out: Harrison Blake, CEO. My stomach tightened slightly, because suddenly everything made sense. The CEO wasn't visiting casually. He had been invited to Brandon's meeting, and if Brandon believed Harrison had already approved his leadership, then this meeting would simply confirm it. Except Harrison didn't actually know that, which meant something awkward was about to happen. Very awkward. Friday morning arrived quietly. Too quietly. The kind of quiet that happens when everyone senses tension, but nobody wants to say it out loud. The conference room slowly filled. Engineers, marketing, sales, support, even a few interns squeezed into the back seats. The whiteboard was already covered with Brandon's latest diagram. Large arrows connecting departments, metrics, growth projections, and across the top, written boldly in black marker, quarter, strategy. Brandon stood near the board, adjusting his laptop. Focused, ready. Then the door opened. Harrison Blake stepped inside. Conversation stopped instantly. Brandon smiled. "Glad you could make it," he said. Harrison nodded politely, happy to listen. The meeting began. Brandon clicked to the first slide. Charts appeared on the screen. "Our teams have made great progress this quarter," Brandon said confidently. He walked toward the whiteboard, marker in hand. He started explaining projections, department coordination, future priorities. From a presentation standpoint, it was impressive, clear, structured, logical. Several employees nodded along, but I wasn't watching the slides. I was watching Harrison. The CEO listened carefully, arms folded, expression neutrale, not angry, not enthusiastic, just observant. Then Brandon said something that changed everything. "As leadership, we believe the next step for the company is," that word again, leadership. And this time, Harrison reacted, not dramatically, just a small movement. His eyebrows lifted slightly, like someone noticing a detail that didn't quite fit. Brandon continued speaking, but I could feel the tension building in the room. because everyone had noticed the moment too. The misunderstanding was sitting in the middle of the conference table, waiting. All it needed now was someone to say it out loud. And suddenly I realized something uncomfortable. That person might have to be me, not because I wanted to, but because I was the only person who had noticed the CEO's comment earlier, the only person who understood the difference between coordination and leadership in Harrison's mind. If nobody spoke, the confusion would continue. But if someone did, the entire room might freeze. Brandon finished his slide. He turned back toward the group. Any thoughts before we move forward? The question hung in the air. Nobody answered. I could hear the quiet hum of the projector, the faint buzz of fluorescent lights. My heart was beating faster than usual. Finally, I stood up, not dramatically, just slowly, carefully. My voice felt slightly unsteady, but clear. I think there's been a misunderstanding about Brandon's role. The sentence landed softly in the room, but the silence that followed was enormous. Every head turned, first toward me, then toward Brandon, then toward Harrison. Brandon looked confused, not angry, just surprised. Harrison tilted his head slightly. "What do you mean?" he asked calmly. This was the moment, the one moment where things could become uncomfortable or honest. I took a breath. Then I explained everything. The reporting structure, the weekly meetings, the decision-making, the leadership lunches, the whiteboard sessions. How Brandon had gradually become the person directing workflow across departments. I didn't exaggerate. I didn't accuse. I simply described what had happened. Step by step, the room remained silent the entire time. When I finished speaking, no one moved. All eyes were on Harrison Blake. The CEO stood quietly near the table, processing, thinking. Finally, he looked at Brandon, and for a moment, no one could read his expression. Brandon looked tense, not defensive, just uncertain, like someone realizing a misunderstanding had grown much larger than expected. Several long seconds passed. Then Harrison smiled, not a sarcastic smile, a genuine one. "Well," he said slowly, "that explains a lot." A few quiet chuckles escaped around the room. The tension broke slightly. Harrison turned toward Brandon. "You shouldn't pretend to be a CEO." The sentence sounded serious, but the tone was calm, almost amused. Brandon looked down for a moment, probably expecting the next words to be far worse. Instead, Harrison continued. "But initiative like that," he paused, looking around the room, "is rare." The room grew quiet again, but this time, the silence felt different, not tense, curious. Harrison picked up the marker from the table. He walked to the whiteboard, the same whiteboard Brandon had used for weeks, the same board where the words "quarter strategy" were written in thick letters. The CEO studied the diagram for a moment, then he added something underneath, a single line, 4 words. He stepped back, and suddenly the whiteboard looked different, not like a stage anymore, not like a symbol of someone pretending to lead, but something else entirely, something closer to what it should have been all along. A place for ideas, not titles. And at that moment, everyone in the room understood something. Brandon hadn't been trying to steal power. He had been trying to create direction. He had simply taken the long way around getting permission, which left only one final question. What would happen next? For a few seconds after Harrison Blake stepped back from the whiteboard, nobody spoke. The room was still, not the tense silence from earlier. This one felt lighter, curious. People leaned slightly forward in their chairs, trying to read the words the CEO had just written beneath Brandon's diagram. The black marker ink was still fresh. 4 simple words. "Ideas are welcome here." The sentence sat quietly below Brandon's complicated arrows and strategy boxes. And somehow, that small line changed the entire tone of the room. Harrison set the marker down on the table. Then he turned toward Brandon, not with anger, not with disappointment, but with the expression of someone who had just discovered an unexpected solution to a problem he didn't know existed. "You built all of this yourself?" Harrison asked. Brandon nodded. "Yes." "Reports, meetings, coordination?" "Yes." Harrison crossed his arms thoughtfully. You didn't wait for permission. It wasn't a criticism, just an observation. Brandon gave a small shrug. I thought the company needed clearer direction. A few quiet chuckles escaped around the room, because that sentence was probably the most Brandon-like sentence anyone had ever heard. Harrison nodded slowly. Then he said something none of us had expected. Next time, the CEO said calmly, start with a conversation. More quiet laughter. Even Brandon smiled at that. The tension that had been building for weeks seemed to dissolve all at once. Harrison looked around the conference room, at the employees, at the charts, at the whiteboard filled with ideas. Then he spoke again. Northbridge has grown quickly, he said. When companies grow fast, structure sometimes lags behind. He gestured toward Brandon. Apparently, someone decided not to wait. More laughter, but this time it felt warm, not awkward. Harrison continued. That kind of initiative can be useful. He paused, then added carefully. When it's transparent, everyone understood the meaning of that sentence. Leadership isn't something you quietly invent, but initiative isn't something you punish either. Harrison looked at Brandon again. You clearly care about improving the company. Brandon nodded. Yes, sir. Well, Harrison said, we might as well use that energy properly. Another pause. Then the CEO said something that changed Brandon's life. I think it's time we create a formal role for this. The room went quiet again. Not tense, just surprised. Brandon blinked. What kind of role, he asked. Harrison glanced at the whiteboard, at the reporting diagrams, at the operational charts. Then he said, Project Operations Lead. A few people nodded immediately. The title made sense. Someone responsible for coordination, workflow, cross-team visibility. Everything Brandon had already been doing. Only now, it would be official. Harrison smiled slightly. And next time, he added, we'll skip the pretending to be CEO part. The room erupted in laughter. Even Brandon laughed, relief spreading across his face. The meeting wrapped up shortly afterward. People returned to their desks. The office slowly resumed its normal rhythm. But something had changed. Not dramatically, just subtly. Brandon didn't stop organizing meetings. He didn't stop drawing diagrams. But the tone was different now, more collaborative, less mysterious. Because now everyone understood what he was doing. And more importantly, a month later, the conference room looked almost the same as before. Same table, same chairs, same whiteboard. But the meaning of the whiteboard had changed. The first time we saw it, it was just a board filled with ideas. Then it became Brandon's stage, a place where someone without authority tried to act like leadership. Now it had become something else, a shared space, a place where anyone could write ideas. Under the old diagrams, someone had written the CEO's words again. Ideas are welcome here. Below it, someone else added another sentence. Titles, optional. The board slowly filled with new notes every week. Not just Brandon's handwriting. Everyone's. Engineering ideas, marketing experiments, support feedback. The whiteboard had stopped belonging to one person. It belonged to the whole office. And Brandon. He adjusted surprisingly well. The dramatic speeches became fewer. The collaboration became stronger. Sometimes he still used big words like strategy and alignment. But now people teased him about it. Friendly jokes during meetings. Careful. Brandon. That sounded very CEO-like. He would laugh and shake his head. No promotions today. As for me, I went back to my normal routine. Morning coffee, headphones, marketing reports. But every Monday morning when I passed the conference room, I would glance at the whiteboard, because the board had become a reminder, not of ambition, not of authority, but of something simpler, that sometimes leadership begins in unusual ways. Sometimes the person acting like the boss isn't trying to take power. They're trying to solve a problem nobody else noticed. And sometimes the difference between chaos and progress is just one person brave enough to step forward. even if nobody asked them to.